All right, so this brings us to the module on child support. The module on child support is a big one. It's probably the biggest one. And there's a lot of information to share with you. So I'm going to break it down in a way that I think is going to be the easiest to understand. But do grab a pen and paper and make sure to make notes and jot down any questions that you have to discuss when we come together. So the federal child support guidelines dictate how parents are to share financial responsibility or financial obligations for their children. And the child support guidelines essentially are broken down by province. So when you're calculating, when you're finding out how much does each parent pay to the other parent and for what, you need to take into account the income of each parent. You need to take into account the number of children, the province of residence of each parent, and the parenting arrangement. So how you calculate these amounts is going to differ depending on whether the children live primarily with one parent, shared time between both parents' houses, or if you have some children that are primarily with one and other children that are primarily with another parent. So you can see it can be confusing. There are three aspects, three different calculations for the child support piece. And I'm going to cover those each separately, and you'll see how they're also intertwined. So the first thing you have is special expenses, or Section 7 expenses, because it's Section 7 of the Divorce Act. Then you have the monthly amount of child support, or the table amount of child support. And then you have the, a category of additional expenses that may or may not be payable depending on your particular circumstances. So, all right. So let's start with special expenses, because that special expenses doesn't depend on the parenting time or the parenting arrangement that you have. Special expenses are a category of expenses that the law says that the parents will share proportionate to their gross incomes. And so there are certain categories of expenses that are always considered special expenses. And then another category of expenses that sometimes are considered special expenses and sometimes not. It depends on the circumstances. The category of expenses that are always considered special expenses are daycare, health and dental insurance premiums and overages, any amounts that aren't covered by insurance, and post-secondary education costs. Now, post-secondary education costs are dealt with quite differently, but let's just talk about the other two categories of special expenses. So the idea there is that you simply identify what is the special expense, what is the amount of daycare, what is the amount of health and dental that is payable, and what is the proportionate, and it's the after-tax cost that is shared between the parties. Luckily, the DivorceMate software helps us, is invaluable in making these calculations. So don't worry about making the calculations, just know that those are the factors that go into calculating it. When it comes to post-secondary education, yes, that's considered a special expense, but the law also says that the child is expected to pay a portion of those expenses. It doesn't identify the portion, but it says a portion, and then the parents are expected to share the remaining balance proportionate to their incomes. Expenses that sometimes are considered special expenses and sometimes aren't considered special expenses are things like, activities like lessons and sports. And what we know there is it depends on a whole host of factors. How much child support is payable? What is the cost of those expenses? Is it competitive? Is it unusual? There's a whole host of things. That's going to be a little bit tricky. You'll probably need some help to calculate that. Okay, so that's special expenses. Special expenses aside, Now we need to talk about what is the monthly amount of child support that's payable. The monthly amount of child support that's payable is going to vary depending on what the parenting arrangement is, how much time the children spend with each parent. When the children, or let's just say the child, when the child lives primarily with one parent, that means at least 61% of the year they reside with one parent. The monthly amount of child support that's payable will be calculated by taking the other parent, the non-primary residential parent. We call that the payor. We take the payor's gross annual income, province of residence, number of children. That gives you the monthly table amount. And there are resources online that are free that you can actually plug that information in and you'll get the amount. That monthly amount of child support is intended to be the payor's contribution to the living expenses of the child. Whatever that amount is, it gets paid to the recipient of child support, the parent who has the child more than 61% of the time. And that parent is expected to pay for all of the expenses for the child with the contribution from the other parent and with their own contribution. Lodging, food, clothing, hot lunches, haircuts, cell phones, car insurance when they get older, birthday gifts to go to birthday parties, allowances, any expense associated with the child is expected to be covered between the contribution from the payor parent and, of course, the contribution from the recipient. All right. In a situation where the child is roughly equal time with both parents, we call that a shared parenting situation, where you have the child with each parent at least 40% of the time. So think in terms of a month, at least 12 days out of the month, just to give you a sense of what 40% is, or 144 days roughly out of the year. It is calculated on an annual basis. And so when a child is with each parent at least 144 days out of the year, then you have a shared parenting situation. In the case of a shared parenting situation, the way you calculate the monthly amount of child support is a little tricky. What the law says is you can deviate from that monthly amount of child support. So let's say you have a situation where you start off with one parent having the child 11 days out of the month, and then the child gets older, situations change, and now that parent has the child 12 days out of the month, 13, let's say 15 days out of the month. That allows you, the child support guidelines say, okay, now you can deviate. Instead of that parent paying that table amount of monthly child support, you can deviate from that. You can calculate that parent's contribution differently, but there are still guidelines and there's still hoops you have to jump through. So what the law says is you take that parent's income, so the parent who now has more than 40% of the time, you take their gross annual income, but now you also take the other parent's gross annual income. And what you do is you calculate how much each of those parents would pay if they were the payor, if the child was primarily with the other parent. So let's say that, according to one parent's income, let's say parent A is supposed to pay $1,000 a month for child support, and parent B has less income and they're supposed to pay $700 if they were the payor. The child support guideline says you subtract one from the other to come up with what we call an offset amount. That offset amount is intended to equalize a little bit the standard of living that the child has in both homes. You see, all of a sudden, if the child is at least 40% of the time in both homes, the living arrangements that the child has to have in both homes are going to need to be more similar. They're going to need to have like, they're there half the time. They need to have their own bedroom, their own space, a place to have a good night's sleep and get their homework done. It needs to feel like home in both homes instead of home here and visiting here. And so the parent who had 11 days and now has 15 really is going to need to, is probably going to have additional expenses of their own now because the child is with them more. They might have to, get a bigger apartment or get a bigger house, depending on how many children you have, right? And so what the law says is if the child is spending equal time or roughly equal time in both of those homes, the law says the child should have a fairly similar standard of living. Rather than having steak in one home and craft dinner in the other, the law says the child's better off having hamburger in both. Not that they're identical, but there's a more similar feel. So if each parent has a very different income, the offset amount comes in and helps the parent with the lower income be able to afford a little bit more in terms of lodging and in terms of food. And by the same token, the parent and it really does depend on, it could go either way. So typically what will happen is the parent who has more income will end up paying an offset amount to the parent who has less income. It's not going to be, depending on who has the most income, it can be quite a drastic change from what the monthly amount of table support would be. So, for example, you could have a situation where, let's say the parent who initially had the child 19 days, if they're the higher income earner, then all of a sudden the offset's going to go this way. All right. Again, there's software that helps us calculate what that offset amount is. Now, once you have the offset amount, see, that offset amount is only meant to sort of equalize your standards of living, which means lodging and food. But everything else, all the rest of the expenses of the child that we enumerated before, clothing, haircuts, hot lunches, cell phones, etc., the law says, okay, well, who's paying for that now? Before, it was the parent who had the child 19 days or more, because they probably were shouldering the bulk of those expenses, even to haircuts. They're probably the one taking the child for the haircuts because they had more time with the child. Now what you want to do is you have to put on paper how you're going to share those expenses. What the law wants to avoid is a situation where a parent who was initially paying the full table amount of child support to this parent because they had the child 11 days goes to 12 days and then starts paying less child support, or perhaps the calculation is no offset if the incomes are the same, and then this other parent still has all the expenses. So what we need to put into the separation agreement is who's paying for what? What are the categories of expenses? Those are examples that I gave you. What are the approximate annual amounts of those expenses, and how are those going to be shared? Got two options. You can share them equally, or you can share them proportionate to your incomes. The more similar incomes, the more it makes sense to share them equally. The more dissimilar incomes, the more the courts will expect that you're sharing those proportionate to your incomes instead of equally. Okay, so that takes care of special expenses. It takes care of the table amount of support that you would have if in a situation where the child is primarily with one parent, and it talks about what we do when the child is spends roughly equal time in each home. The third category that we talked about was if you have one child who is primarily with one parent and the other child is primarily with the other parent, or multiple children. So just to keep it simple, if you have one child that is primarily with one, let's say parent A, and two children are primarily with parent B, then what's going to happen is you're going to calculate how much child support does this parent pay for two children, and how much child support does this parent pay for one child, and you're going to subtract one from the other. So it's similar to the offset, it's just calculated in a different way because it's the full amount, one child, two children. Okay. What I think is really important is to separate, even though the parenting plan, the amount of time the child resides with each parent is tied to the calculation of child support, I really believe strongly that we should keep it separate. I always say to my mediation clients, the child support guidelines aren't really designed for parents like you, parents who take their financial and their uh, parenting obligations to heart. The child support guidelines were created in 1997 to make it easier for lawyers and parties who were in court to be able to, who didn't get along, who didn't agree, to be able to calculate the child support piece. So when we're dealing with two parents who, by the time you come to mediation, you might already have some sort of arrangement that works for you, that what's important is that both parents are contributing to the child's financial support in a way that makes sense to the two of you and in a way that allows both of you to not lie awake at night worrying about whether or not you can pay your rent. We want to make sure that the child has their expenses covered and that one parent isn't shouldering all of those expenses. All right? Okay. Let's leave that here for now, and we'll come back in the next video to talk about all the other pieces that go with child support.